Number 53.
Good morning, everyone. The scripture reading this morning is in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. And I'll start in verse 12 if you'd like to follow along. And I'll be reading from New King James. I, the preacher, was king over Israel and Jerusalem. And I set my heart to seek and search out, by wisdom, concerning all that is done under heaven, this burdensome task God has given to the sons of man, by which they may be exercised. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and indeed all is vanity and grasping for the wind.
Well, good to see everybody this morning. I see that lots of people decided to leave as I got back. So a little lighter this morning than normal, but it's good to see everybody who's here, and want to talk a little bit more about wisdom as I was doing before I left on my trip. The thing about wisdom, though, is that wisdom is really, I think, the heart of almost all human philosophy, that is searching for some kind of purpose. What's the reason that we're alive? Why are we here? What are we doing? What's the reason? What should we do? I mean, if you think about everything that people do and try to think about why they do what they do, it really is trying to figure out wisdom. What's the reason? What's the purpose? And the book of Ecclesiastes actually is Solomon's account of his life's search for meaning on earth. And it really does, for the most part, specify that he's not looking for eternal, heavenly purpose, but just an earthly purpose. And every time he comes and says, when he looks for earthly purpose alone, that it ends up being empty. And it's like you're trying to grab wind. But as soon as you grab wind, and if you enclosed wind, it would cease to be wind, wouldn't it? Because wind is air that's moving. And if you enclose it, it would stop moving. And so every time we want to grab it, some kind of life purpose, without God, without eternity, we end up feeling empty. And I think this is found pretty universally. People search out, in their own lives, jobs or different aspects of life we think are just going to solve and make everything good and make everything blessed and happy. And we find out it doesn't. And it really doesn't matter what that thing is. You try to make the end-all, be-all of everything, it doesn't end up really fulfilling. And so what is the purpose of wisdom? Because I've talked about how important wisdom is, but I want to talk about what Ecclesiastes describes as the costs of wisdom. It isn't free. It doesn't have, you can't acquire it without giving up something. And you do give up something with wisdom. You also, though, it has benefits to life. And so, kind of summation, there are things we give up to have wisdom, but it's better to have wisdom than to not. And that's kind of what Solomon writes about in this, in his account of his search for purpose of life under the sun. And so I want to remind us, kind of things I've been talking about for a number of weeks. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And we often debate, what does it mean to fear the Lord? It means to have a great respect for, but it also means to have some terror there. God, why do we respect him? Because he has power and he can do something, and ultimately, though, he's our judge. And so the beginning of wisdom is about the idea that everything we do, and what we say, and as Jesus himself talked about, every idle word you're going to account for. There's a judgment for everything you do. That is the beginning of getting wisdom. It's not the end of wisdom. It's not the middle of wisdom. It is the beginning. You knowing that you're going to account for what you've done. Even the things you think you've got away with. Right? Parents didn't figure them out. Didn't get caught by the police. All of those things, you lay them out. You lay out your life before the judge. You give an account. Which one of us would ever go before the judge with everything we've ever done or said in our life and feel proud of it? Not feel ashamed of the things we've done. And the only thing that allows us to have confidence is the sacrifice of Christ. His blood, what he did for us, is what makes us holy and righteous. Not us. And that's clear. Anybody who's honest with themselves is clear in your own life. And you don't have to be really old to know that. It's like, if you're 60 or you're 30 or you're 15, you already probably have a list of things that you're ashamed of, that you've done in your life. And now some you might have gotten caught, but some you probably didn't. But you still know about them. And God knows about them. And that's the beginning of wisdom. That we have a respect and an honor and a fear for God, knowing that he is our God, our Lord. Now, James, we talked about this a few weeks back, but James describes the difference in worldly wisdom and godly wisdom. And we understand when people say people are wise, very often what they mean is they've gone to school. They've got acquired knowledge, and they have information, and they have the ability to use that information for a job. And we often call the people who are the wisest the ones who get the jobs that make the most money. But a lot of them are idiots. They just are. Because information doesn't make you wise. It often makes them fools. It makes them smart fools. It makes them having a lot of knowledge, a lot of information, but they're fools. And that's actually what Paul writes about in the letter to the Corinthians. That oftentimes we think of people who are smart in a worldly way as though they're wise. They're often fools. And that's the point God made. He used the foolishness of the cross to make the people who think they're so smart to not fall for it, to be tripped up by it. And so James describes what worldly wisdom does and where it leads us. That it ultimately is self-centered. It is jealous, earthly, disorderly, and leads to bad practices. It really has at its heart the emotions of people, right? Whereas God's wisdom is meek, and I talk about that quite a bit. It doesn't mean weak. It actually means strength under control and under someone else's control. And peaceable, gentle, reasonable. And it leads to good practices, to love God and to love your neighbor. That's what the philosophies and the wisdom of God is pointed towards. So we talked a lot about that in the past. And then the last time, I talked about wisdom. And wisdom isn't hidden somewhere. And it's not difficult. It's not difficult to find, even though everybody thinks it is. But that's because everybody wants to find their little slice of wisdom that nobody else has. But that's not real wisdom. And why would you want to find a piece of wisdom that nobody else has? Think about what's at the heart of that. Self-centeredness. You want to be special. You want to be different. You want to be better. And that is, at its heart, worldly, not godly. And so wisdom calls out. And God has been sending his wisdom into the world for eons. And so I described in Proverbs 1 and chapter 1 and chapter 2 the passages there that talk about wisdom calling out in the public square, where worldliness is private. It's always trying to sneak something. But it's calling, and it warns us that we need to listen. That we need to not, as I said here, using a current euphemism, to ghost her. Turn away from her. I don't want that. Give me something else. But when we listen to wisdom, he said the Lord will provide for us. Now, coming into today's, I want to talk about the cost. First one is the sorrow that it leads us towards. In Ecclesiastes 1, starting verse 15, what is crooked cannot be made straight. What is lacking cannot be counted. I said in my heart, I have acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me. And my heart has had great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. And I perceived that this also is but a striving after wind. He goes, all this effort that I did to try to understand foolishness and wisdom. And remember, the opposite of wisdom is not being dumb. The opposite of wisdom is to be a fool. It's just like the idea, wise doesn't necessarily mean smart. Doesn't mean you have tremendous amount of information or that you can recall it easily for a test. Wisdom, I remember some good friends years ago. A good friend who had struggled to finish high school, converted another friend who had advanced degrees, had licenses in brokerages and investments, and one of the things that he told me later, so the well-educated friend, what really bothered him, and he had actually gone to a religious school all of his life, even in college, was this uneducated plumber telling him about the Word of God, and he was like, he couldn't answer anything he said. He thought he was wrong, but he had no ability to answer it because he wasn't answering the plumber's wisdom. He was answering God's wisdom. You're not going to defeat it. Doesn't matter how smart you are. And it always really stuck with me how the wisdom of God does that. How it elevates us regardless of our talents or abilities or intellect or ability to remember things. But wisdom has another effect too. He says, for in much wisdom is much vexation. That's the idea of like troubles. And he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. In an old Bible I actually have a note there. I mean, one of the first times I was really reading this and studying this in my 20s, and I wrote, ignorance is bliss. That is an actual like human little proverb, isn't it? Not a God proverb, but it's a human proverb. Ignorance is bliss, and it's often true. We look at sometimes really innocent, naive people enjoying something, and we are sitting there thinking, it's kind of nice to be innocent and naive and enjoy this thing, because now we don't enjoy it that much because we understand it more, right? We have wisdom about it. And that's one of the things wisdom does, is that it brings sorrow. It isn't going to make you always happier. It isn't going, think about, I've always been struck by Elijah. This great prophet who, after defeating all of the prophets of Baal, and this great victory for God over all these false prophets, and yet not long after that, when Jezebel wants to kill him, sending all her armies after him, he's wishing he wasn't alive. He's so depressed, essentially, or bothered that he just doesn't want to be alive anymore. And, God essentially takes care of him and before he finally sends him some other helpers. Because you think, well, we sometimes think, well, the more godly somebody is, the more wiser somebody is, well, they would have it all together. Well, nobody has it all together. And that's one of the points that he makes in the book of Ecclesiastes. It really doesn't matter how wise or how smart, because one of the things that's going to happen to you is a lot of unfortunate things are going to happen, regardless of how wise you are. Regardless of how smart, regardless of how talented, things will happen to you because that's what happens to everybody on this planet under the sun. And so sometimes I think we're inclined to not want to know. Because I don't want to know. In fact, Rich and Dave and I will talk about this from time to time. How, when you're younger and, it's like, oh, you kind of hear gossip about something, one thing or another, and you're sort of interested in what might be happening, things maybe you should or shouldn't know about. And we talk about the fact all the time, people might go, well, have you heard such and such? Like, don't tell me. I don't want to know. If you want my help, let me know and I'll help. But otherwise, don't tell me. Because I don't want the burden because I don't want to hear it and know about a problem that I then feel responsible to try and help. And so gossip has a way of, it kind of entices us. It makes us hear things, but you can't unhear them. And so the wiser and the older you get and the more you've listened to stuff, the more you go, no, I only want to hear the things that are necessary to hear. Otherwise, leave me out of it. And that only comes through the trouble of having heard too much. The vexation of it, as the scripture says. And so there's a cost of wisdom. It doesn't come easily. It doesn't come cheaply. And it does take away some of the joy. I was just reading recently, an actress talk about the fact that she can't enjoy movies anymore because now she knows how they're made. It's like probably a butcher who can't really enjoy a hot dog because he's seen how the hot dog's made, right? It's like if you enjoy a hot dog, you don't want to know how they're made. Well, that's kind of what wisdom is. It sometimes allows us to see behind the curtain the Wizard of Oz, and now he's not so great. So another one talks about the futility of wise living. I actually think this is one of the more interesting sections about this idea, because the idea of living wisely is certainly godly, and God teaches us how to do that. And Jesus talks about it a lot, about living and doing well. But here, Solomon talks about how it doesn't really change anything. You'd think, well, you should have a better life because you live wisely. Do all the wisest people you've ever known have all the best lives? Do some of the people who seem to have great lives seem to kind of be the opposite of wise and be a fool? Certainly. Because the two aren't equated. We want them to equate. We'd like them to equate, but they don't equate. And so often it's futile. Now, futile in the sense of life under the sun. Not in the bigger picture, when we start to include eternity and heaven. But in life under the sun, he says, I turn to consider wisdom and madness and folly. For what can the man do who comes after the king? Only what has already been done. Then I saw that there is more gain in wisdom than in folly, as there is more gain in light than in darkness. So there's one of the advantages. It's better to have wisdom than to be a fool. But, he says, the wise person has his eyes in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I perceive that the same event happens to all of them. Then I said in my heart, what happens to the fool will happen to me also. Why then have I been so very wise? And I said in my heart that this is also vanity. He says, all the bad stuff that happens in the world, it happens to wise people just like it happens to foolish people. And that's what he essentially saw that, and he went, so what's the advantage? It's like the exact same thing. It sort of depressed him to know that the bad stuff that happens in this life happens regardless of how smart or wise you are. And he says, and so I said in my heart that this also is vanity. For of the wise as of the fool, there is no enduring remembrance, seeing that in the days to come, all will have been long forgotten. Most of us, we know our parents. Maybe you know your grandparents. Maybe you know them well. Maybe you don't. Kind of depends on kind of family size, ages, and all those different things. I mean, 3 of my 4 grandparents had been gone for a while before I was born. But that's what happens, when you're the 7th child of a 13th child. They hadn't been around. A number of them hadn't been around a long time. But so I don't know them. I only know one grandmother, only because she lived like 99 years old, and I only really saw her for when I was little. But I don't really know her. I don't really remember her. And that's just a couple of generations. And that's the truth of every single one of us. That we like to think we're making this big imprint on the world, but the truth is, in a generation or two or a few after us, they won't know us. And that's kind of sad to think, isn't it? We don't like that. But that's reality. In fact, very often the only people that are really known are somehow something got written about them, or they wrote something about themselves. And often even all of that information isn't always completely accurate. So very often we only know certain people for certain things, and often then within a few generations it ends up kind of a caricature of that person, not the whole person, the good and the bad. We look back through history now, and we want to condemn all of the evil people who've ever done something evil. The problem is, if that's your practice throughout, we're going to condemn everybody who's ever done something bad. That's everybody. There is nobody just put on a pedestal, because we've all done bad things, but we've all done good things too. People are more complex than the caricatures that last for a few generations. And so this made Solomon upset. He's like, what's the point of all this? And he says, how the wise dies just like the fool. So I hated life, because of what is done under the sun was grievous to me. For all is vanity and a striving after wind. It made him grieve to understand all these things. Now, here's the thing. If you didn't understand all this, would you not have the same grief? He had a grief because he understood something that probably not everybody else in his time did. And so he suffered a sorrow and a vexation that others didn't, because they don't think about it, don't worry about it. And so he says it's all vanity. Vanity means it's empty. It's worthless. It has no real value to it. And it's a grasping, a striving, trying to grab the wind. Now, the next one. And really, a lot of the book is about this. I just am taking a few of them. Will lead to a conclusion in future weeks. But the contrast of wisdom and folly, of being wise or being a fool. He says, and 7 through 13, you can go through more than this. I'm just going to look at a bunch of these little proverbs he gave us about The difference in wisdom and foolishness. A good name is better than precious ointment. Now, precious ointment, he's talking about really expensive, like perfume or something, right? Well, how many people would rather have the really expensive stuff more than what people think of them? A lot of this world would rather have the nice, expensive stuff, right? Rather than what people think of them. But he says it's better that people think well of you than for you to have really nice stuff. He says the day of your death is better than and the day of death than the day of birth. We don't think this way in general. Do we think when somebody dies that was a better day for them than when they were born? We don't think that way because it brings us sorrow and grief because we miss them because they're gone. But especially for those who go to be with God, that's a much better day than the day to be born into this world. Because what do you know about every child being born into this world? And this is not what you go and say at their birthday parties, or celebrating the birth of these children. Wow, this is going to be so great. They're going to have years and years and decades of really terrible stuff. Aren't I so glad? Well, no. But that is true. As Ecclesiastes tells us, the work God has given us to do under life under the sun is hard business. And that's the reality for everybody born into this world. And so we don't think that. We don't always understand that. We don't feel it. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. We all want to go to the party. A lot of people don't like going to the memorial, where we remember that we've lost somebody we loved. But it's better for us when we think about the people we've lost and what happens to all of us. Because, in fact, one of the passages I'm not going to talk about today, I'll talk about in the future, one of the things about wisdom is, teach me to number my days. Teach me that I only got a few of them. That is at the heart of wisdom. To know that you don't have that many. You won't have a ton, a lot, and it's a finite number. It's a whole lot closer to zero than it is to infinity. In fact, in the concept of infinity, the amount of days you have on this earth is essentially mathematically zero. And so he tells us that's part of wisdom, though. And that's where wisdom comes from. Wisdom doesn't come from the party. And he says, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter. And yet, which one of us chooses sorrow over laughing? Which one would you rather be doing? Crying or laughing? But one of them is better for you. He says, for by sadness of face, the heart is made glad. It's hard to have laughter and joy and happiness if we don't know what sorrow is. There's a contrast between the two. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. The heart of the fools is in the house of mirth. It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. It's better for somebody who cares about you to come and tell you how you're messing up than it is to hear people sing how wonderful and great you are. We don't, well, one we like and the other we don't. But one's wise and the other isn't. For the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity. Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the heart of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. When we talk about this, and it's so common as we get older to talk about how things have changed and how they've changed for the worse. But that's not completely true. Very often that is what we think, because when we look back on the past, we often tend to romanticize it. And there's some actual kind of reason for that. Our brains seem to be inclined to remember good things longer than they remember bad things. So we might remember really good things that happened in our past and forget, though, some of the bad things that happened at the same time. They really weren't better. And that's unwise to even be thinking that way. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. So wisdom is good with that inheritance. These things are an advantage. It is an advantage to have wisdom. It is an advantage to have an inheritance for those living in this world. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money. And the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. So he says there's two things. He compares wisdom to money. And you should understand, having money is a protection in this world. It is now, it always has been. It is much better to have the most expensive lawyer you can afford if you're in court. And you go, well, that's just, it's because we're so unjust. Every place is unjust. Every country has been unjust. It has always been true that having a lot of money gives you power and protection. It has always been true in every place, at every time, in every place on this planet. But he says wisdom is even better than that. Because that protection just provides you something here for a little while, the protection of wealth. But the protection of wisdom has the promise of life. This is one of the few places he hints at the idea of something beyond life under the sun. But he says, consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. He said, think about the idea of the circumstances of this world, how God made things. You can't change them. I can't change them. And sometimes we'd like to change them, but we can't. And so that's an important understanding. That's an important wisdom to have, that I can't change the realities of life just because I would like to. That leads to worldly wisdom, not godly wisdom. And then finally, we'll end with this passage. And I'm going to hit some of Ecclesiastes again, but wisdom is still better. It's still better to be wise than to be a fool. So in chapter 9, he says, again, I saw that under the sun the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, nor favor to those with knowledge, but time and chance happen to them all. You can take the smartest people, wisest person, wrong place, wrong time, and they lose everything. You can take another person, not nearly as smart, not nearly as wise, not nearly as capable, and the fortunes of their time and their place and the circumstances bless them with an abundance. Is that because one was better than the other? No. That's life. Bill Gates wouldn't be Bill Gates if he had done exactly what he did, but he did it 20 years later. Because everything he did, other people were doing at his time. And somebody else would have done it. It's not like he was the only one that created, he didn't create almost anything that he built his empire on. But he was there. And he did a good job with what he knew. And he built it. But time and place. Doesn't make him smarter, doesn't make him wiser, doesn't make him better. And that's the reality of life. And it's just like when the economy in the world, something collapses, there's a war, and you lose everything. Does that mean make you unwise? No. It's the reality of life. That can happen to one versus another. And so he says, for man does not know his life, like fish that are taken in an evil net, and like birds that are caught in a snare. I was thinking about this recently. I don't know what I was doing, remember, but I remember watching fish, and something, animal was predator around, ready to eat him. It's like, what is that fish thinking right before it gets eaten? Didn't know, it's just living its life, everything's normal, and it became food. Just like that. And that's the reality of life, that is actually what happens to all of us. We don't know and have any idea of what happens after tomorrow and the next day. We think we know, we have plans for it, but if something completely shakes it up, I mean, 2 years ago, when we first started hearing about, sickness in China, I remember hearing about it in January, 2 years ago. And my thinking was, I wonder if it should affect my choices of investments. I didn't do anything about it. But who knew a few months later what would happen? We didn't know. And so that's what he's telling us. Wisdom doesn't help you know everything. And it doesn't fix everything. And it doesn't make everything better. But it's better than being a fool. And that's where he goes. I have also seen this example of wisdom under the sun. And it seemed great to me. There was a little city with a few men in it. We're going to end at this little story he tells. Because it's really cool, and it's also kind of sad, I think. A little city with a few men in it, and a great king came against it and besieged it, building great siege works against it. And there was found in it a poor wise man, and he, by his wisdom, delivered the city. Yet no one remembered that poor man. But I say that wisdom is better than might, though the poor man's wisdom is despised and his words are not heard. It is better to have the wisdom of that poor man, even if nobody ever remembers you, than to just be remembered. It's not about being remembered. It's about being wise. Wise has its own blessings, regardless of whether other people recognize it or not, or whether it leads to money or not. Because it doesn't. It doesn't necessarily mean money. And it doesn't necessarily mean good fortune. And it doesn't necessarily mean a better or longer or more abundant life. Because all those things are subject to chance and other influences. But wisdom is better than being a fool. And that's the point he makes. He says, the words of the wise heard in quiet are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. I picture so much of politics when I read about passages talking about rulers shouting in their foolishness, because that's what I hear from almost all of them. He says, wisdom is better than weapons of war. But one sinner destroys much good. Like he talks about dead flies make the perfumer's ointment give off a stench. That's kind of follows up on that idea. It doesn't take much to kind of ruin things. And, we understand, we have lots of like human proverbs about one apple, right, ruining the whole bunch. But it's still better to be wise even if nobody knows, even if nobody remembers or acknowledges it. Wisdom, just for the sake of being wise, is helpful to living a godly life. And we're going to talk about the importance of that later, but we'll end there this morning. I appreciate your time today. We're going to close out with another song. And if you're in need in any way, please reach out to us, whether it's coming forward so we can let everybody know your situation and pray for you. But if it's anything that we can help you in, please reach out in any way you can. Talk to us, and if we can help you, we want to. Let's go ahead and stand and sing.